All right, welcome everybody. We've got a lot of folks joining us, some people still trickling in. I see a lot of familiar names and a lot of folks I don't recognize, so that is awesome. And please let us know in the chat where you're coming in from and what community you represent. I am Jonathan Weber. I'm the Complete Streets Program Manager here at Local Motion. I'm going to be the host and speaker for tonight's webinar. My colleague Susan Grasso is hopefully going to be joining us. She's having some technical difficulties, but for now, I'm going to do my best to get us going. Thank you all so much for being here today. I'm really excited for this Learning Network webinar event, and I hope you find it really interesting. We'll have everyone muted throughout the webinar, but I'm going to be doing my best to monitor the chat while I'm presenting. For any questions you have, if you have a question, feel free to put it in the chat or in the Q&A, either way. We have a lot to cover tonight, and we'll do discussion at the end. But again, throw those questions and comments up when they come to you. And when we get to the discussion, we'll also have opportunity for you to raise your hand to ask questions. If you have any technical issues, post them in the chat box. And this is being recorded. We'll share the recording with you in the next few days. And let's get started. So this evening, I'm presenting how to make your place better for walking, biking, and rolling. And just a note, when I talk about rolling, I'm referring to getting around in a wheelchair or with a walker or any kind of assistive device, or even some kind of vehicle that maybe a light electric vehicle that doesn't quite fall into walking or biking, maybe a scooter, for example. This is the first in a series of webinars that's intended to give you, as a walk, bike, roll advocate, the knowledge and tools you need to make change in your community. Local Motion's mission, we are the statewide walk bike advocacy group, and our mission is to make it safe, accessible, and fun for everyone to walk, bike, roll here in Vermont. As I said, we are a statewide organization. We're a pretty small organization, around 10 or 11 full-time staff. And so in order for us to succeed in our mission, we really need folks like you working to make change in your community. One of the ways we support you is through educational resources like this webinar tonight, and we have 4 more planned for the coming months listed here on this slide. This series, it really takes the knowledge that I have, that our staff have, and it distills it down to the most essential things for you to know and be successful. We're, of course, still available to you to work with you, to support you. That's a big part of our work at Local Motion, is working directly with local walk bike groups. But we really want to also equip you with knowledge so that you can do more on your own. And we will be sending out a link to register for all these webinars in the resource document that you'll receive over the next few days. So just to give us a little bit of sense of where we're going tonight, first off, I want to express what we're trying to achieve so that we're at least on the same page for this evening. Just what is the change we're trying to make in our communities. I want to orient us in history, so talk a little bit about how we got to the point where we need a movement for walking, biking, and rolling. I'll offer a theory of change, sort of a hypothesis for how we can get from where we are to where we want to go, and we'll discuss strategies to achieve that change. So here's sort of our grounding statement for tonight. I know that not everyone is going to be on the exact same page and might desire some tweaks to this wording, but we're gonna run with this tonight. I am the dictator for this evening, so this is what we're gonna use as our vision for the change that we're trying to make. And our focus tonight is going to be on the walking, biking, and rolling portion of this statement. We're not going to talk much about transit, but it's definitely closely tied to what we're going to discuss. So the statement is, we're trying to achieve communities where it is safe, comfortable, and convenient for everyone to get around by walking, biking, rolling, and using transit. And I wanted to start off by acknowledging that we used to build very walkable places as part of what's referred to as the traditional development path. And if we had continued in that mode of development, I think today we likely would have great places to walk, bike, and roll. The traditional development pattern is really characterized by human scale design, most of people's daily needs being within walking distance. The development, the building of houses and shops and the built environment occurred, incrementally and continuously, by which I mean that the development was responsive to economic and social demand in those communities. So if a person owned, a one-story shop on Main Street and they were successful and knew there was demand for housing, they had the ability, the community allowed them to evolve that building to maybe include ground floor retail with apartments or maybe offices above. This is a very common development pattern that we see in this image here in Brattleboro. Houses surrounding the commercial area often grew to include commercial activity as that economy grew and the center commercial area grew. And this is still the visible development pattern in our historic downtowns and village centers. And the truth is that those historic downtowns and village centers really haven't changed all that much since the middle of the 20th century. In a sense, we locked them into the state that they were in at that point through various different policies. Of course, there were also rural areas and people living in them, but when we look at the urban spaces that we built, it was really the traditional development pattern is what we were doing. And this is how humans built places for thousands of years. It's a consistent pattern that we see across the globe. What has changed a lot is the areas surrounding our traditional town centers. We've built that formerly rural land into a very spread out, sort of isolating pattern of development. So, what changed? How did we go from building walkable places where people lived in proximity and in relationship to each other to building neighborhoods like this, where they were really separated from the rest of the community, separated from commercial areas, and where neighbors are rarely seen outside of their houses or cars? How did we go from so many of our daily needs being within a short walk to needing to drive for practically everything? How did we go from working near where we lived and shopped to having long commutes to get to work and back? And why is it that our traditional town centers struggle so much? Why do they look basically the same as they did 70 years ago, just with more space devoted to cars? How did we go from building places for people to building places for cars? How did we get here? And the process by which we got here is broadly referred to as the suburban experiment. The suburban experiment, it's thought of as starting somewhere in the early 20th century, around the time of the Great Depression. It included, a lot of policy and different changes went into it that aren't shown on this slide. But this shows some of the key things that happened, especially at the local level. Through development codes, first we divided the city into zones, zoning, so that housing was separated from destinations like work and shopping. We limited density, and this made it impossible to build the kind of traditional development that characterizes how humans have built places for thousands of years. And we restricted residential development in particular so that single family homes and massive apartment complexes were really the only things that could be built. There was very little in between. There weren't duplexes and fourplexes and sort of medium-sized apartment buildings. It was either a single family home or a huge apartment building. There was very little of what we now call missing middle housing. We also required huge amounts of off-street parking to be built with development that did occur. And this became another impediment to traditional development, which requires buildings to be clustered close together, right? If you're building a lot of surface parking, that inherently takes up space on the lot. And so the building next door can't be as close as it otherwise would have been. We then, of course, built a lot of infrastructure for cars, not people, right? The streets that we were building to connect these places were very car-centric. And of course, all of these changes were made possible by the advent of the car. We wouldn't have developed in such a spread out way if it didn't exist. And the way we were building also reinforced the need for cars. And that car ownership reinforced the way we were building. This is just sort of a historical artifact. This is pulled out of Burlington's neighborhood code project, which is now looking at reforming zoning and land use in the city to allow for more varied types of development and sort of return to that more traditional development pattern. So this just shows how Burlington zoning changed during the 20th century to divide housing from other uses, limit density, and require parking, all the things that we've been talking about. So here we are, having undergone a century of this suburban experiment. Our communities are really struggling to maintain all of the infrastructure associated with the low density suburban sort of unproductive development that we've built. Our dependence on cars is having terrible impacts on everything from the climate crisis to social isolation to our safety when we're out in our communities. So how do we get to a better place? This is where we acknowledge that our task as advocates involves, stopping and charting a new course after this sort of unsuccessful suburban experiment. And while we know what traditional development looks like and what safe walking, biking, and rolling infrastructure looks like, the undoing of this experiment is also going to be experimental. No one has this totally figured out. And so as advocates, it's really important that we stay humble and also keep in mind that this is a long-term challenge that's not going to be solved overnight. But we do all have a role to play in our place and time. So the challenge of creating walkable, bikeable, rollable communities is about both land use and transportation. These two things feed into and affect each other, and anything we do that affects one affects the other. I sometimes find the analogy of two ropes tied together to be helpful. So those land use and transportation ropes can either be braided such that they become stronger as a whole and are mutually beneficial and useful to society, or they can get tangled in a way that's really unproductive and harmful to society. The land use patterns and transportation systems that are often talked about by people like me who advocate for better walking and biking, places like the Netherlands, places like Japan, these are systems that you can think of as braided, right? It's an efficient braid that benefits the health, equity, and sustainability of those societies. And the transportation system and the land use sort of make each other stronger. They support each other. Our transportation system and our sort of land use is an inefficient tangle. It results in harmful outcomes for our society, like traffic violence, social isolation, lack of economic access for people who don't own cars, and it's of course very unsustainable. So you can think of our task as advocates as to pull on these two ropes through our work in ways that loosen the tangle and create opportunities for it to become braided. To loosen the land use rope, we need to allow for and encourage denser mixed-use development in the vein of the traditional development pattern. And just to be clear, like when I say denser mixed-use development, I don't mean Manhattan. I mean development that looks a lot like the downtowns and village centers that we have and cherish today. To loosen the transportation rope, we really need to stop adding capacity and infrastructure for cars and make walking, biking, and transit the most comfortable and convenient ways to get around. Neither of these things can happen in isolation. Both need to happen sort of simultaneously and incrementally. Just for example, like removing parking minimums from development codes, which we're going to talk about in a minute, is a key land use strategy. But if we're going to have development with less or no parking, we also need to create viable alternatives to driving so that people don't need to own a car in order to live. Also, like if we're going to have a dignified public transportation system, we need to have the density needed to create demand and allow for efficient operation of that system. So as I said, transportation and land use feed into and affect each other. And there are ways in which positive and negative feedback loops can either more tightly tangle or more tightly braid the ropes that we've been talking about. So the red inner circle here shows a feedback loop that perpetuates the suburban experiment, and makes us more car dependent. The green outer circle shows a feedback loop that encourages traditional development and creates more opportunities to walk, bike, and roll. So just sort of looking at these cycles and starting out where it says people choose to live farther from work on the red inner cycle. So say you have a family and that family chooses to live farther from work. That means, they're going to drive, assuming that's the only option they're really presented with. And if they drive, that means that roads are going to get more crowded. Parking is going to become more scarce or perceived as more scarce. And this in turn can cause the community to build more lanes for driving and build more parking if enough people choose to live farther from work. When those lanes and that parking gets built, traffic might flow a little smoother, although you will probably have less people using transit. As traffic smooths a little further and parking is more available, driving is going to become more appealing, and that can cause more people to live farther from work. And then you again wind up in a situation where you have crowded roads and scarce parking. So you can see how this cycle sort of builds on itself. The alternative is sort of this green outer cycle, and we'll start sort of in the same place with people choose to live closer to work. So let's say a family makes that choice to live close to where they work. For that family, transit is going to become more convenient, as well as walking and biking. Hopefully they make that decision to take transit or to walk and bike to work and to school. And that means that there's lower demand for driving, fewer people driving. And if fewer people are driving, we can devote more public space to walking and biking because we don't need as many lanes for cars. We don't need parking. There isn't as much demand, as much public perception of a need for those things. That gives us the political will as well as the space to create more appealing, walkable urban spaces. And by more appealing walkable urban spaces, I both mean in terms of quality and in terms of quantity. And that means more people will be able to live closer to work, especially when we build more of those kinds of spaces. So you can see how these two cycles feed into each other and how any one thing can accelerate or decelerate either cycle. So local motion mostly focuses on transportation, and we're going to largely focus on that for the remainder of the presentation. But it's very important for local walk, bike, roll advocates, even if you're focused on the transportation side, to understand what's happening on the land use side and consider supporting changes to your local land use development regulations. So I want to mention a couple of key policies to consider, starting here with exclusionary zoning. So exclusionary zoning is the sorts of zoning that prohibit many housing types in mixed use development. Any kind of zoning that says, residential low density, single family only, when you see really big setbacks in a lot, and when you see that you can't have commercial development in a certain neighborhood, that is exclusionary zoning. And it keeps neighborhoods from naturally evolving and sort of thickening up. It creates barriers to construction of a lot of the less expensive forms of housing, and that can contribute to economic segregation, right? If you can't build a duplex or a fourplex or a small apartment, then you're not able to build a lot of the entry-level forms of housing, and thus you're restricting sort of the economic level of access to that neighborhood. So to reform this, it's really about allowing denser housing and more mixed-use development. So just for example, in a neighborhood that was previously zoned for single-family homes, this might look like allowing accessory dwelling units, duplexes, fourplexes, making it possible for someone to open a corner store so that people can get groceries within walking distance. The second policy reform I want to highlight is minimum parking requirements. These require a certain amount of parking to be constructed with any given development. So, in the example shown on this slide, you have what was presumably a single family home or an empty lot before. And if that property owner wanted to build instead a fourplex or 4 residential units on that property, a parking requirement would often say you have to have 1 or 2 spaces for each of those units. In this example, it's 2. And on most residential lots, you're just not going to be able to fit 8 surface parking spaces. And so the alternative is to put them underground, build a parking garage, and that costs anywhere from $40,000 to $100,000 typically per space. So that pretty quickly makes that kind of development prohibitively expensive. Because it makes development prohibitively expensive in the core area, it encourages more development outside of the core area, where the parking minimums also apply and results in large parking lots at that surface level. So you get a lot of sprawling sort of strip mall, low density development. So to reform this, it's really about simply removing these parking minimums, or even implementing parking maximums where there's a cap on the amount of parking that can be built for the development. And both Burlington and South Burlington have done that. So that was a very high level look, just at a couple of policies to sort of loosen that land use rope. There is much more to think about and plenty of weeds to get into. And as I said, local motions focus is really in the transportation space. So that's what we're going to talk about now. So to loosen the transportation rope, we need to make walking, biking, rolling, and transit safer and more convenient choices. And we also need to stop building infrastructure for driving. So how do we make this transition to get more people walking, biking, and rolling? We're going to talk about bicycling specifically. Infrastructure still, it really matters for walking quite a lot, and we will talk about walking and rolling infrastructure. But it's important to know that land use is arguably more important for walking, since as long as there are sidewalks and good crossings, the key to allowing more people to walk is to have more destinations within walking distance of where people live. I'm also not going to get into transit too much because it's just not my area of expertise. So this is a graphic of the 3 types of potential bicyclists. And the idea here, and this is based on multiple studies, is that somewhere around 70% of all people, and I'm not just talking about people who currently ride bikes, I'm talking about all people, are potentially willing to bike for transportation. That 70% that's potentially willing to bike for transportation is divided into 3 groups. So the experienced and confident cyclist, shown on the right, is someone who will ride just about anywhere, regardless of what the infrastructure for biking might look like. It's the kind of rider you might see on a shoulder of a state highway, and only about 1% of potential bicyclists are this kind of rider. And this kind of rider has what we call a high stress tolerance. Many of the people here tonight are probably casual and somewhat confident riders. I count myself in this group. We're shown in the middle. So painted bike infrastructure might be enough for us on certain streets, and we're willing to endure some sketchy situations every once in a while as long as our rides are mostly okay. The infrastructure in most of Vermont's traditional towns and villages might be sufficient for this type of rider, but we'd really still rather be on a better, more comfortable infrastructure, and we'd like it to be in more places. But we're only about 70%, or 7%, excuse me. The vast majority of potential bicyclists are the 60% interested but concerned, shown on the left. And these people are generally not riding right now, except for on bike paths. And the reason why bike paths are so crowded is because these people are on them. And if we build good infrastructure along our streets and roads, these people would ride there too. They have what we call a low stress tolerance. The key to success in getting more people out biking in particular is to build infrastructure that is comfortable enough for the interested but concerned rider. And it's important to understand that doing so is also key to ensuring that our funding and capacity to build infrastructure is being used equitably in a way that most people will benefit from. I encourage you to check out the webinar on level of traffic stress that we did just a month or 2 ago. That goes into this in much greater detail. And there will be a link to that in the resource document that you'll receive in the coming days. So when it comes to designing safe infrastructure that will feel comfortable for the interested but concerned rider, there are some fundamentals that are really helpful to understand. First off, the speed at which people drive is the result of cues that we take from the roadway and the surrounding context. So those cues include things like the width of the road overall, the width of the lanes, how close the buildings and trees are to the road, whether the road is straight, curvy, how the intersections are designed, and much more. So, while there are reckless drivers, right, if you see like one person going 20 or 30 miles an hour faster than everyone else, that's a reckless driver. But when most drivers are going over the speed limit, that's not an indication that something is wrong with the humans driving. It's an indication that the design of the road is giving those drivers cues that are not aligned with the surrounding context and how fast we want cars going in that context. So things like signage, speed limits, and education, they're going to have a pretty limited real effect in and of themselves. If we really want safety, it's about changing the design of the road. This graph is sort of a framework through which you can understand the interaction between car speeds and the surrounding environment and how this contributes to danger or safety. So speed is shown here on the y-axis, and an environment in which cars are moving at a high speed is not necessarily dangerous in and of itself. Complexity is on the x-axis. And an environment in which there is a great deal of complexity and unpredictability, like a parking lot or a downtown street or anywhere that there's a lot of human elements happening, that's not necessarily dangerous in and of itself. But when you mix speed and complexity together, you really get danger for all users, both people inside of cars and outside of cars. To emphasize this and sort of go into a little more detail, we're going to talk about the difference between streets and roads and look at some variations between those categories to give you a sense of what safe infrastructure for walking and biking looks like in each one. So first off, just a definition, a street, we're going to call it a platform for a community to exist and create social and economic prosperity. So this is an environment with a lot of complexity because it's for people and community. So there's a lot of humanity here and people are complex and unpredictable. So you've got them crossing the street. You've got deliveries happening to businesses. You've got events happening. So because this is a complex environment, high speed, if it's present, is going to create danger. But generally speaking, as long as speeds are low, mistakes that the humans make here are going to be of low consequence because the speeds are low. So you might get fender benders, but you're not going to get deaths. To make a street safer, the key is to keep speeds low. And the lower the speeds are, the more successful the street will be in terms of its value to the community. And the better it's going to be for walking and biking and rolling as well. So at really low speeds, people walking, biking, and rolling can share the street with people driving. Shown here, Provincetown is an example. You can also think about the intersections where cars cross Church Street as being spaces where people and cars can pretty safely share them with some negotiation between those people. And in a shared space street like the one shown here, it's often not even necessary to mark crosswalks. Some places have even successfully implemented what are called naked streets, which have no signs and no kind of traffic control, even at the intersections. They basically rely on design cues and the interactions and negotiation between the users at low speeds to ensure safety. Here's an example of just a more, sort of Vermont-y shared space street. This is Warren Village. And you can see how the surfaces of the street, which are cobbled, sort of indicate to drivers that they're entering a different kind of context. You'll also see that the sidewalks are flush with the street. They're not at a raised level. And this encourages people to move from sidewalk to street freely, and it's another cue to drivers that this is a different kind of environment. Elements like the granite posts and the trees and the foliage close to the roadway give drivers a sense that their space is constricted and that they have obstacles to watch out for. And that makes them pay attention and drive slowly. Let's say you have a street that's a little bit faster, we'll call it a low-speed street. Cars are not going any faster than 25 miles an hour. In this kind of environment, you're going to need more separation between people driving and people walking, biking, and rolling. It's not going to work well for people to mix in the street. That will not be what we would call low stress infrastructure. In this kind of environment, painted biking infrastructure can be sufficient, especially if there are not a lot of cars, if volumes are low. But even in this sort of environment, having some protection for people on bikes is desirable. And for people walking and rolling, sidewalks are necessary, and it's important to make sure that the crossings are short. People shouldn't be having to cross more than 2 lanes of car traffic, or probably not more than 22 feet or so. They should be signed, and the car should be going pretty slow in these environments. So we just talked about streets, and I'm just gonna suggest that if cars are going faster than 25, you don't have a street. You might not have a road, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But we just talked about streets, and now let's talk about roads. A road is a high-speed, efficient connection between 2 places. Roads, as I said, have high speeds, but they have low complexity, and therefore they're pretty safe. And they have low complexity because they've been intentionally simplified. There are very few intersections, and they're designed to separate users so that conflicts don't occur. The consequence of mistakes in a road environment is reduced because the environment has been simplified and there's a wider margin of error. It's also notable that we have different types of roads, and not all include cars, right? We've got railroads, which are intended to be high-speed connections between communities. They're not especially high-speed here in the US, but the point stands. In a road environment, the key for walking and biking infrastructure is to have complete separation from the roadway, right? On a road, you do not want to be on a bike anywhere near to fast-moving cars. So as I said, on a road or a highway, the walking and biking infrastructure should be totally grade separated, and the degree of protection and separation from the road has to increase as the speeds on the roadway increase. At intersections, which should be pretty few and far between, it's important to ensure that there's physical and temporal separation, so separation in both time and space from people walking, biking, and rolling, and people driving. So that could be through use of roundabouts, sometimes through use of signal timing, through use of protected medians where a person crossing the street has a curbed protected area to stop after they cross a lane or 2 of traffic. And it's important to have slow car speeds at the intersections when people walking, biking, and rolling are crossing. So I just talked about streets and roads, and this nice contrast between streets as a place for people to be productive and roads as high-speed connections for people to go from one community to another. And that must sound really nice, but as you know, of course, we don't have a perfect system of only streets and roads. Some of our streets mix in elements of road design, and some of our roads mix in elements of street design. And both of these are sort of where we get into trouble. So we took elements of road design, like wide lanes, clear zones, and sweeping turns that worked great for safety on our highways. And we made the mistake, and by we, I mostly mean roadway engineers, and we applied them to our streets, thinking that it would make us safer there too. We also, on our streets, prioritize the movement of cars by adding more lanes, signalizing intersections, and these elements all cue drivers to go faster, as we've been talking about. But of course, the complexity surrounding those streets remains, so these places became more dangerous. At the same time, we allowed and encouraged development along our roads through land use decisions. And this is what resulted in miles of strip malls and sprawling residential development. And all this development outside of our traditional centers, as we've talked about, made more people drive since destinations were being built outside of walking distance. So we have these mixed things where we've taken elements of streets and roads, and we have these hybrids. So how do we make them safe for people walking and biking? We have a word for these hybrids. They're called stroads. And the suburban strode is what you get when you have a road where you've allowed development to occur. And stroads are really considered the futon of transportation because they don't function well as a road, right? Sometimes speeds can be high, but there's a lot of stopping and going at all of the lights. So they're really not all that efficient in terms of getting from one place to another. They also don't function well as streets because they're not productive places for communities to build social and economic wealth. The development that happens along these streets generally does not generate enough in property taxes to pay for the massive road that services it, all of the sewer and water and electricity that gets run out to it. And of course, they're very dangerous because they have both simplified road design elements like wide, numerous lanes, clear zones along the side of the road that signal to drivers that high speeds are safe, but they still have the complexity of a street due to all the driveways, which create conflicts between drivers turning. They have, people walking and biking since there are employment and shopping destinations around along them, and typically some transit access. So these, suburban strip mall stroads, like the one shown here, are probably the greatest challenge we face in terms of safety for walking and biking. And really the only ways to make these places really safe are to reduce the number of driveways and intersections, which would sort of turn them more into roads, or to have redevelopments occur so that they become more like streets. So there would be more businesses closer to the street. We would reduce the number of lanes, and they would become slower, safer environments. But both of these processes are really challenging. There aren't a lot of examples of either one happening in the US, and they're going to take time. Stroads can also exist in our urban areas where we've allocated, so much space to cars that speeds become high and unsafe when mixed with the complexity of the surrounding environment. So with an urban strode, the key is to slow car traffic by removing and narrowing lanes and using that space for walking, biking, rolling, transit, and enjoyment. So this would convert them back into streets. And this slide is an example of a pretty low-cost project that showed how a street in Rutland that had road elements in the form of very wide lanes can be improved to give drivers the design cues that they need to drive at a speed that's appropriate and safe for the surrounding environment. Efforts like this one to reallocate space from cars for other uses are sometimes met with resistance because people are worried about traffic and congestion. So I'm going to show you a video explaining induced demand, which is a key concept to understand and will help you address these concerns. Okay, I see that people are not getting the sound, so I'm gonna move on from this, but there will be a link to some videos and some content on induced demand. Essentially, what induced demand tells us is that people adjust their transportation behavior based on the options that they're given. So if there's not a lot of congestion, not a lot of traffic, and driving is convenient and within their means, then they're going to make the choice to drive. This also tells us that we can disincentivize driving and incentivize other modes by stopping projects that create capacity for cars and providing alternatives to driving that are more convenient. So, taking space such as driving or parking lanes and using it for, other modes of transportation is one of the best ways to get people from driving to do other things. So how do we actually make this change happen? How do we go from this car-centric society and culture to, to a better culture, to a more efficient transportation land use system? How do we improve our transportation system as advocates? In this slide, I'm showing change at the top, represented by the grass growing, and culture represented at the bottom as the nutrients from which this change can emerge. And so, if we start at the bottom, your culture, culture and people supporting these ideas can result in increased public support for investment, right? That's what it means for more people to support this stuff. That's increased public support. And when you have increased public support for something, that can be translated into increased political support. And if you're talking about infrastructure improvement, that political support can result in infrastructure improvement. When you get infrastructure improvement, that hopefully means safer, more comfortable facilities for walking, biking, and rolling. As we've been talking about, when you make things safer, we can tap into that huge percentage of the population that's willing to walk, bike, and roll. And so that means increased rates of walking, biking, and rolling. And as more people are out there walking, biking, and rolling, we'll have more people supporting these things and more people wanting, more bike lanes, more better sidewalks, more safer streets. So that, in turn feeds culture further, results in more political support for investment, and you can see how this is a cycle that can build on itself. Anything that you can do to hasten these parts of the cycle, including just sort of feeding the nutrients of your community's walk bike culture, will help to make change happen faster. The work of building this culture and making this change is advocacy. And I just want to say that transportation advocacy can be slow, it can be confusing, it can be frustrating. It can also be incredibly gratifying, and it's some of the most important, effective work that can be done to address many of our current problems. So, just some tips here. Find some friends. I don't advise you trying to do this stuff alone. It is best done with some friends or at least fellow advocates. And know that you're a part of a larger movement. You're not alone. There are lots of people working on this at different levels. Practice what I call patient urgency. So you need to be patient on the inside in order to burn yourself out, in order to not burn yourself out. Like recognize that this stuff is going to take time. And just because you're not seeing the changes happen as fast as you want them to, that doesn't mean that you're not being successful. So be patient on the inside, but bring respectful urgency and persistence to your advocacy on the outside. Stay focused. There's so much that you could do in this kind of advocacy to make progress. Choose the things that are important to you, that you think will have the most impact, that you want to work on, and really stay focused on them. And get some help. Reach out to Local Motion. We have on our website a page with lots of local walk bike groups. There may be one already active in your area. If not, we can help you form one. We may be able to connect you with other like-minded people. Just some additional tips for finding other people interested in this kind of work. Pay attention, if people are complaining about an unsafe intersection or speeding on social media, or you're hearing discussion about this stuff at town meetings, these are opportunities to reach out and see if these people are interested in actually working to solve the problems that they're upset about. So talk to others that you think might be affected by an issue that concerns you. If you live on a street with a cracked sidewalk or no sidewalk at all, chances are your neighbors are probably annoyed by it too. So chat with them and see if they want to get involved. I really encourage folks to form a little group, kind of make it official, give it a name, and that way people have something to recognize you by, and they feel like there is something to join. When it comes to building infrastructure, it can be a complicated and frustrating process, but just some broad steps here or milestones to think about in building infrastructure. You need to start with a need, so know what you're trying to fix. talk to your town staff. They're the ones that are generally in charge of your streets, your sidewalks. And if it's possible, just get the stuff that needs to be fixed immediately, right? If we're talking about painting a crosswalk or fixing a couple sidewalk panels, encourage your town to just do it. Don't get mired in a study or bureaucracy. Just really pressure them to get it done, or at least to budget for it to do it next year. If the immediate fixes aren't possible, a study is typically where things go in the transportation world next. So you got to get the study done, try to get the best outcome possible for walking and biking in the study, using some of what we've talked about here today as principles. Fund what's in the study. There's a lot of state grant funding. You will also need some funding for the municipal level. And we have a webinar coming up specifically all about funding walk bike projects in Vermont. Think about a master plan that if your community it has a lot of needs, if you're trying to figure out what your overall biking network is going to look like, think about doing a master plan, which is a kind of study that sort of prioritizes all the different projects, figures out at a high level what the network for biking and walking in your community needs to look like. And we also have a webinar coming up on that. I mentioned building culture as really important. Here are some ideas for that. Hosting a regular ride, putting on a community discussion about the issues in your town, putting on a film screening to sort of highlight the importance of walking, biking, and rolling to the success of your community, having a regular walking club, setting up some kind of way to communicate with your fellow local advocates, whether that's a page on Facebook or a Google group or a Discord. That could be really helpful just to keep the momentum going and get people engaged. Finally, as I said, Local Motion is here as a resource for you. We provide technical assistance to walk bike groups all across the state. We do a lot of different things. It's sort of intended just to help you wherever you are, to progress your work and help you move forward. We also do advocacy support. If you are lobbying at the local level to get a project done, we can help support you with that through email blasts, through communication support, lots of different things we can do there. We put on learning network events like the one we're doing tonight. And we also, of course, we are the state level advocates. We are focusing as much as we can on state level lobbying, taking what we learn as barriers at the local level through working with folks like you, and then trying to implement the policy changes that are needed to address that at the state level. As I said, we've got a lot of great content coming at you this winter in webinars, and we'll provide the link to register for all those in the chat and in the resource document that we're going to provide after the webinar. So that's it, and I look forward to taking any questions, comments that folks have, and having some discussion. I know we covered a lot tonight. So let's see. Do we have Susan? Susan, are you here?
Yes, I am.
Susan, do we have any questions to answer?
So not too many questions right now. So please, share any questions or thoughts that you might have. We do have one about electric bikes and whether you think that e-bikes will result in a significant increase in demand for bike paths and lanes and bike infrastructure in general.
Yeah, I think that e-bikes are a real sort of game changer for our advocacy movement. I think that they make transportation, biking, and recreational biking more accessible to just so many more people. I think that e-bikes have brought a lot of those interested but concerned and also the enthused and confident riders like us and actually gotten them out riding more. And I think they also solve some of the barriers in terms of riding a greater distance to get to your work. We talk a lot about sort of regional bike networks, getting from Winooski to Burlington, from Essex to Winooski, from communities outside of there, and I think that e-bikes make those regional commutes more realistic.
Great, thank you, Jonathan. I'm not seeing any other. So Bill Reagan wanted to make a book recommendation. I've actually read this book too, Paved Paradise by Henry Graeber. It really does go into a lot of detail, and it really makes you wonder how it is that we end up devoting so much of our valuable real estate in this country to the storage of motor vehicles. So great recommendation, Bill. Let's see, Tim. Brings up his town, Northfield, where they started a series of meetings organized by the Vermont Council on Rural Development. Let's see. So they had a town conversation, and out of that came 4 task forces, one of which is about accessibility, walkability, walking, and pedestrian safety. This group, which I'm part of, has done just the sort of networking that Jonathan is talking about here. And as he said, having an identified named group gives us recognition. We've gotten together a very compatible and positive group, which is working currently to promote sidewalk improvement, especially around the local school area. Thanks for the encouragement about sticking with it and making contact with like-minded folks.
Yeah, that's awesome, Tim, and lots of great work happening in Northfield, and thank you for all of your work there and for being involved. We had a cool pop-up project in Northfield a couple of years ago that was sort of Northfield has had a very cool painted walk that was sort of a temporary sidewalk connecting one of the parks to the village center. And the pop-up project that we did sort of extended that to connect it better to the town green. So that was very cool. Lots of good dynamic work happening in Northfield, and Tim, of course, reach out if Local Motion can support you at all.
And we have one other question asking whether there's a significant backlog of planned or proposed bike paths that have yet to be constructed.
Yes, there is, and in different ways. So, you know, just generally, there is always sort of a backlog of transportation projects because they just take so long to get done. The process to go from planning to design and construction takes a while, and so you know, there's a lot in the works that is going to happen that just isn't built yet. There is also a lot that has been planned that communities want to build, and for which there is just not funding to build it. Many of the key funding sources from the state are competitive grants, and we know that many of those grants are oversubscribed. The bike and pedestrian grant, for example, is one of the primary sources of funding for construction projects and for planning, and that grant has funded, I think it's something like 30% of the requests over the past 5 years. So that represents a really significant backlog of projects that just didn't get funded. So that's one of our key priorities as an advocacy group, is to advocate for more funding to get more projects done.
And just a reminder that we will be holding a webinar that will talk in detail about funding opportunities for local communities. So, please check that out. And I did add the link to our webinar series for the remainder of this winter in the chat.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thanks for doing that, Susan. And yeah, as I said, folks, we'll send out a resource document as well. It's going to have a lot of great info in terms of, sort of some more reading if you're interested on everything that we talked about tonight, some videos. It'll have some good stuff in there, and they'll probably get that early next week. There will also be a recording to this, which you're more than welcome to share with anyone you see fit. So I'm not seeing any other questions. So thanks everyone for coming, and we hope to see you next time. Hope you enjoy the rest of your evening.